You know, it's my great pleasure right now to introduce to everybody a man who really needs no introduction.
Karl Dragon King.
I'm not calling the fans geeks. I'm not calling them rednecks, tobacco chewing nothing, because I've done all that myself.
Karl Dragon King. Karl.
In your dreams, you will see me. Excuse me, please, let's don't talk negatively. I'm going to win the title. I'm going to keep my money and buy me some good old Tennessee drinking whiskey with it.
Thank you for being such a great husband.
And this is for you, Fannie Mae. Solid gold, baby, just like you and me.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the 1,000 Hours Podcast. I'm Karl Stern, your host. What in the world is 1,000 Hours all about? If you've stumbled on this podcast, perhaps at WrestlingObserver.com or on the free feed over at WhenItWasCool.com, maybe wondering 1,000 hours, what's that even about? What's going on here? Well, it's all about the pioneer era of pro wrestling, the 1800s, the era, in fact, before Frank Gotch. Now, this show, I've found out, one of the most popular shows. In fact, right now, I think it's the most popular show I do at my website and at Observer. It is because it's of interest not just to pro wrestling fans. And look, let's be honest. I know nobody wants to hear this. It's a dirty little secret. But pro wrestling is not super popular right now. It's way down the pop culture food chain right now. Wrestling is cyclical. It comes and it goes and has ever since the 1800s. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk today probably a little bit about a time in the 1800s where it's starting to cycle down. It had been enormously popular. Newspapers everywhere were covering wrestling. Wrestling was drawing better than 10,000 people at times, all the way back in the 1880s. But then it starts to cycle down, and I'm at a point right now in my research where the newspapers are even talking about, gosh, look, wrestling's really not popular right now. And so, look, that doesn't mean we're not fans of it. We love it. That's great. It's wonderful. Enjoy what you enjoy and make no excuses for it. But in the generality of popular culture right now, pro wrestling is at a low ebb. You never see it anywhere in pop culture. We're going around, nobody's wearing T-shirts. Even the action figure aisles, which have been long packed with action figures, is the shelf space is shrinking. And you just don't hear that many people talking about it, whatever. But don't worry, it'll cycle back around. That doesn't mean it's still not great. Maybe you know some of your favorite stuff may be happening right now, and that's fantastic. But it's of interest not just to pro wrestling fans, but to sports fans, to history fans. I hear from a lot of people who are interested in just the historical aspect of what I'm doing here in my research. And I'm researching this because I've loved the Pioneer era for many years. I've been researching it for over 25 years now. I did our first Pioneers of Wrestling special booklet that's available on the Patreon at When It Was Cool. I've done that back, 25 years ago, I guess. Maybe not 20, maybe 23, 24 years ago. And I had long been, spent several years researching the Pioneers up to that point. Well, now we have a lot more to go by. There are millions of pages of newspapers online right now where you can go back and for your own self. If you want to spend the time researching it, you can for your own self read about what was happening in the day. Not to mention there have been not a lot, but a few books along the way dealing with it. A lot of the books, and this is what I'm trying to correct right now, there's really not that much dealing with the Pioneer era. There are several books out and have come out over the last number of years that start with the Pioneer era and touch upon names like Colonel James H. McLaughlin and William Muldoon and Evan Strangler Lewis, but that's a starting point. The bulk of the book is going forward. Especially, there's a lot of love and romanticism about the Frank Gotch era and George Hackenschmidt and Ed Strangler Lewis and that whole period of wrestling. But where we end at is the beginning of Frank Gotch's career, because there is so much rich history that's never before been talked about, never before been published to the degree we're going to publish it. And my book, Dragon King Karl's Pioneer Era Wrestling Omnibus, I'm getting very close to completion on it now. And so very soon I hope to have an announcement of what date that's going to be available. And that's what we do here on this podcast. We dive into this research. One of our very important Patreons, foundational Patreon member, as a matter of fact, No Friender, he, had said to me at one point in time, look, I could listen to you talk about the pioneers of wrestling for 1,000 hours. And I thought, well, that's a great name for a podcast, but I can only do it if it's supported. And the way you support this podcast, the only way it keeps going is, number one, become a new Patreon supporter when it was cool. And look, I'm going to be honest, we can use some new Patreons right now. We've been kind of stagnant for a little while. Our numbers haven't dropped any, but we haven't gained any great gains over the last couple months. We could really use a fresh influx of new historians, new minds, new fans, new people wanting. And we don't just do Pioneer Era stuff over there. We do pop culture and retro pop culture as well. We have over 2,000 podcasts in our archive. I put out a newsletter every week, articles. Look, it's plenty of entertainment for your $5 a month. So I hope you'll come to whenitwascool.com, try us for a month to see. And if you do, I will dedicate an hour to you. If you're not a Patreon, if you're already a Patreon supporter, you just don't want to do Patreon, you can sponsor a single episode. Most people donate between $10 and $50 for an episode, depending on what do you think it's worth. And so we're sponsored through episode 75 right now, but we could use some new sponsorships coming along. All the links are on the front page of whenitwascool.com. So I've got a special note to begin with this episode. Before we dive back into the 1880s, the early 1880s, where wrestling is really changing, really evolving, we have moved out of the era of Colonel James H. McLaughlin, the first major wrestling star in the United States. Now, he wasn't the first wrestling star. There were others before him. Homer Lane was the American champion at the time. But Colonel McLaughlin won this tournament in 1870 in Detroit, Michigan. That really is, the more and more I research, the more and more it confirms to me, it was the genesis. It was the big bang, if you will, of professional wrestling in the United States. While it existed before, it was what really put it on the pop culture map, put it as something people would pay to see. It solidified things. It gave a unified set of rules. It was covered, coast to coast in the newspaper. Colonel James H. McLaughlin became a well-known sports figure, more so than he's ever been given credit for. But we're kind of, as we go, that was the 1870s. As we transition into the 1880s, McLaughlin had been kind of retired for a while. He was a train engineer as his full-time job, and he had really settled into doing that. And it gave way to the rise of a guy named William Muldoon. And William Muldoon was a New York City police officer. He was very much a celebrity in the papers for all intents and purposes. And he drastically changed professional wrestling. One of the things I think confuses a lot of people, and I hope to clear up some of this mythology with my book and this podcast, people think that the wrestling in the 1800s is not like it is today. They think, hey, Cody Rhodes and Roman Reigns and Kenny Omega and Will Ospreay, these people have nothing at all in common with a Colonel McLaughlin or a William Muldoon or Professor Theobald Bauer or anything like that. It's two totally different things. You may yourself be saying, hey, those are the guys, those are the pioneers of mixed martial arts. It's the UFC that owe them. No. Absolutely a mythology. Completely wrong. What McLaughlin, Muldoon, Bauer, Miller, Lewis, all of these wrestlers we've been talking about now for quite a while. This, by the way, is episode number 57. This is hour 57. And I want to thank Vaster S. Vaster S became a Patreon supporter when it was cool, and you're hearing this because of him. And so this hour is dedicated to Vaster. Thank you very much for giving us a try at whenitwascool.com. But these guys were so many of the things that nowadays we recognize as just part of pro wrestling, they were being developed then. They had different names for different styles, and I think people mistakenly think of, okay, when I think of amateur collegiate wrestling, I think of freestyle, I think of Greco-Roman, I think of, that, and even transitioning into shoot fighting, like catch wrestling and things like that. So they hear these terms and they think it's that. It's not. Don't let these names fool you. In every sense of the word, it's professional wrestling. Where you may hear a term like catch as catch can, and you may associate that with catch, modern shoot catch wrestling, don't do so. If you hear, they are related, but it's far more related to professional wrestling. When you hear terms like collar and elbow, you think, okay, well, collar and elbow, they still do collar and elbow hookup. That's how a lot of matches start. It's a transition spot for wrestling. Yes, that developed in the pioneer era, had a whole style name to it. You may hear Cumberland style or Greco-Roman in particular, because Greco-Roman became an Olympic sport, and people know when you talk about wrestling, this Greco-Roman in the pioneer era is not that. Think, instead of relating it to those, instead relate it to things like in the modern era you have American entertainment style pro wrestling. You have lucha libre in Mexico. You have hardcore wrestling, like the ECW. You have strong style wrestling like in Japan. Those are just names of a subset of wrestling where things are just presented a little differently, but it's all pro wrestling. That's what was happening back then. Don't think for a second these guys were doing amateur collegiate wrestling. They were not. Now, it may have looked like that. It may have mimicked some of that, but these guys from the start were working matches. They had predetermined wins. The newspapers were on to it. The wrestlers themselves there were several instances. We've talked about many recently. The most recent one was Clarence Whistler, a very famous wrestler, the arch rival of William Muldoon. He went to the San Francisco newspapers and told them straight up, look, our matches are fake. We worked every one of them. The reason me and Muldoon split up is because, we just couldn't get along. And, he didn't want to, I wanted to win certain matches, and he wanted to win certain matches. We just couldn't agree on it. William Muldoon went in front of a crowd in Portland, Oregon, talking about Donald Denny, a very famous strongman and wrestler, and told the crowd when they got into a disagreement, he went right in front of the crowd and told everybody, said, look, hey, Donald Denny doesn't want to wrestle me because him and this other guy, D.A. McMillan, they're fake wrestlers. Have been going on putting these fake shows on for a long time. They're called hippodromes back in the day. And been putting them on. I'm real, and that's why he doesn't want to wrestle me. And as I said, and I think this analogy is very true, William Muldoon wasn't real either. Now, he was more real than most. I liken him very much to Ed Strangler Lewis. Now, Ed Strangler Lewis wasn't real either, but he was real enough, and everybody was scared of him. Ed Strangler Lewis could, for real, beat you in a wrestling match, but the majority of his matches were worked. The majority of his matches were agreements, prearranged, fake, if you will. I don't like to use that word because we know wrestling's not really fake, but it was a show. But here you got this tough guy that could, hey, if you don't want to go along with the show, I can beat you for real. That's kind of William Muldoon back in the day. He's like, yes, Donald Denny, we will in fact have this hippodrome match, and you will win this fall, and I'll win this fall, and you'll win this fall, and then I'll win the whole match. Or I can just beat you. Your choice. And, one of the things with Clarence Whistler is the question was a little bit in doubt. Clarence Whistler was a super tough guy, very mean guy. And I think at Greco-Roman wrestling, the style that was Greco-Roman back then, and see, that's one of the things about William Muldoon, he kind of legitimized that style by being this tough guy. It's kind of the same way Ed Strangler Lewis did. And Lou Thez gave that presentation later on as well, where it's like, yeah, you can say wrestling's fake if you want to. Come in here and give me a try. Vern Gagne the same way. Come in here and give me a try, and you're going to lose. That was the gimmick even in the 1800s. And whether it's the 1880s or the 1980s or the 1870s, 1970s, it was the same deal. So understand, this Pioneers of Wrestling, this 1,000 Hours, my upcoming book, The Pioneer Era of Wrestling, where I really, more so than has ever been done ever, we're telling these stories, and I'm telling them because I'm going back. I have gone through thousands and thousands and thousands of newspapers. This has been many years in the works. And as more becomes available, I can get even deeper in there. So much of what we thought the Pioneer Era of Wrestling was presented to us through books like Milo Tolundo's, Fall Guys. These books were written 30, 50 years or later after that era, okay? Without the benefit of actual really being able to go back in the newspapers and look at that time. They didn't have online archives like we've got today to go back and research this. All they had was tall tales from their predecessors. There is so, like I'm if I have room, and I'm going to try to work this in. If not, I'll do it over on our Patreon at When It Was Cool for sure in one of the newsletters. I really want to go through Milo. From Milo to Lundos was a book that was written, I think, in the 1930s. And so much of the stuff that I've heard and knew and thought I knew about the Pioneer Era, the original source of that was from that book. And I have found that that book is full of huge inaccuracies and a lot of mythology. And I kind of want to go take a whole section in my book, and if not, we'll for sure do it here on 1,000 Hours, where we go through that book and I tell you what was right, what was wrong, and what was just the story, the kayfabe story, if you will. So I hope you'll consider, continue to sponsor the show, and certainly hope you'll consider getting the book when it comes out. But the best thing you can do is help us on Patreon, where we really could use some new folks coming by. But one of the things I want to do today is one of the really great wrestling historians, and make no mistake, I guess I'm a wrestling historian. I've always liked to call myself a chronicler more than anything, because so many people have really done the research. Well, now I realize I have put in literally thousands of hours, no pun intended, doing research myself over the last year. So I guess I am a historian. But there are many other really good historians, not people who just repeat the story. Okay? There are people that actually put in the work and have the knowledge. And I mention some of them regularly. Mark Hewitt is definitely one of those. Jason Campbell is another one. There are many. Phil Lines is one of those guys. Okay, Phil Lines is a guy who absolutely 100% knows what what he's talking about. I don't know if Phil's listening to the show or not. I have no idea. But if you are, Phil, much respect to you. And Phil posted this recently about the Terrible Turk, Yusuf. Now we've done a couple shows on Ismail Yusuf, the Terrible Turk. He was one of the first big gimmick guys here in the United States. He was in the very late 1800s. He came over here and was just pushed like an 1800s version of Bill Goldberg or the Ultimate Warrior or something, Hulk Hogan even. He was unbeatable. He was clearly a worker, and the newspapers just loved him. And then he gets this, through tragic circumstances, he gets this story you could only create in a movie, where he's going back to Europe with his belt full of gold that he's got here in the United States by putting on fake wrestling matches, and his ship sinks and he dies. So now he's got this incredible story to go along with that. And we've tried to work through some of the truth and the mythos of the Terrible Turk, the original Terrible Turk, Ismail Yusuf. And even on one of the recent shows, broke down a lot of more personal information about him. Well, Phil has come along and he said, look, there's still a lot of mythology about Yusuf, and let's talk about it. So I will, defer to him. He has certainly done more work on Yusuf than I have personally. But Terrible Turk is a huge figure in Pioneer Era Wrestling, and let's see what Phil has to say. He says, a ton has been written about the original Terrible Turk, Yusuf, but there are some things that need to be pointed out as people get them wrong. And I will go ahead and admit, I'm one of those people getting it wrong, and I don't want to get it wrong, so let's let Phil clear the air here. His real name, all right? His real name was Yusuf, Y-U-S-U-F, Yusuf. Not Yusuf Ishmael, not Yusuf Ishmaelo. I've been guilty of repeating both of those because his biographical information online claims that. Well, so this is the type of stuff I'm working to dispel. This is the type of stuff I'm working to get right. And Phil says, that's not it. It's just Yusuf. Back in those days, Turks typically did not have legal last names, so they went just by their first name. The Ishmaelo last name was a kayfabe last name given to him when he went to the United States. Amazing. This is great information. That said, his father's first name was Ishmael, and that's probably where the idea came from. So basically, it would be like, son of Yusuf, son of Ishmael, that kind of deal. He just put it together and come up with that name. A kayfabe name. That's great. The spelling of his name. The Turkish spelling of his name is Yusuf, Y-U-S-U-F. Yusuf, spelled like the word Y-O-U-S-O-U-F, was the common spelling used in France, while Yusuf, yet another spelling I've seen with two S's in it, was the common U.S. spelling. The birthplace, ethnicity. People sometimes get confused and think he was Bulgarian because he was born in what is today Bulgaria, but that is wrong. Yusuf was born in the village of Karlar, which was in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire ruled over Bulgaria for 482 years, and once Bulgaria got its independence back in 1878, Yusuf's birth village was now in Bulgaria. Later on, that village got renamed to Cherna. As a result, Yusuf, who was around 20 years old at the time, gained Bulgarian citizenship. But he was 100% Turk himself, as both of his parents were Turkish, and he was born an Ottoman citizen. The names he was or is known by in Turkey. In Turkish oil wrestling, he was initially known as Samnulu Yusuf, which means Yusuf from Samun. Samun is the region where his birth village is located. And also as Karalarli Yusuf. Yusuf from Karalar. Back in those days, since Turks typically do not have last names, wrestlers would become known by this pattern of a name, the town or region they were from or lived in, plus their first name. Later on, Yusuf took on an apprentice whose name was also Yusuf, so eventually, in order to distinguish between the two popular wrestlers in Turkey, Yusuf of Shuban became known as Büyük Yusuf, or Big Yusuf, and his apprentice became known as Küçük Yusuf, or Little Yusuf. This was after Yusuf's first French tour in 1895. Little Yusuf was also part of that first French tour. However, in France, Little Yusuf went by Mehmed. Today in Turkey and in Bulgaria to an extent, Big Yusuf is known as Kaka Yusuf. Kaka is pronounced like, oh, I'm sorry, I've been saying it wrong. Should put the pronunciation first. Koja. And they can have different meanings, including big, great, and strong. The name given to him in Turkey a couple years after his death. The Terrible Turk nickname. When he started wrestling in France, March the 20th, 1895, he was not known as the Terrible Turk yet. The first use of that nickname I've been able to find was for his April 12th, 1895 match against Fenelon. In other words, it took a few weeks for the Paris promoters to decide to give him the said nickname. Now his French run. When discussing his run in France, people tend to know only about the initial 2 months at Falaise-Bigère in 1895, and then the infamous match with Abraham Mahmoud later that same year, which we talked about, I think, on our first Terrible Turk show. However, Yusuf's run in France was much more extensive than that. He had additional matches in Paris, and more importantly, he toured all over France, on and off, in 1896 and 1897. Now, his age during his U.S. run. When he wrestled in the United States, Yusuf was between 39 and 41 years old, and not 30 or 32 like some U.S. articles have claimed. Okay, I'm going to have to definitely go recheck mine because I think I've got that earlier date of birth or earlier age in my book upcoming, and that's why people like Phil Lyons are so important to what we're doing here. I've seen conflicting information about whether he was born in 1857, 1858, or 1859. Most Turkish sources say 1857, but the Turkish source I trust most, Atif Kararam, mentioned 1858 in one of his books, and then 2 years later said 1859 in another book of his. And so this is great information and very helpful, Phil, and I'll make sure that gets transcribed over into Dragon King Karl's Pioneer Era Wrestling Omnibus book. So let's take a break right now mid-show. We'll spend the second half of the show looking more back at this time period of the early transitioning in the mid-1880s, which we've been talking about. A time period very interesting because Colonel McLaughlin's about to come back to wrestling, or has come back to wrestling. Muldoon's having some issues. He's out in San Francisco, and he's hitting a few bumps in the road out there. And we're going to look at this transitional period here. And wrestling's about to really start scaling back in popularity, and we'll look at some of the reasons why right after this.
WhenItWasCool.com is your source for the best in retro pop culture. When It Was Cool features articles and podcasts on retro TV and movies, toys, action figures, pro wrestling, food, video games, and more. Hit the Patreon button to support us and get instant access to hundreds of premium podcasts and features. Family friendly and fun. WhenItWasCool.com.
All right, we're back. And again, I want to encourage you to support us over at WhenItWasCool.com on our Patreon. We have over 2,000 shows available for you there to listen to. I have multiple shows every week dealing not only with pro wrestling history, but retro pop culture as well. Plus a newsletter we do every week, feature articles, and much, much more. I want to pick up in October of 1883. And we had talked a little bit in the last episode about earlier 1883, and we've talked about, it was the year of tournaments. St. Louis had a big wrestling tournament. Richard K. Fox saw how successful the St. Louis tournament was, and so he held one in New York, Buffalo, New York to be exact. And but wrestling was also very popular on the West Coast and had been for a long time in San Francisco. Originally, Professor Theobald Bauer and William Miller had taken their Greco-Roman Wirt wrestling entertainment deal over there and had much success, but they'd really burned out the town. The town had really caught on to the fact that this Greco-Roman wrestling was not on the level. and said moved on. And so San Francisco had been down for a little while, but now Muldoon's out there. Again, he's out there because the play he was working for, the entertainment company he was working for, he had a role of, he actually played, imagine this for typecasting, he played the role of a wrestler in a play, and they were set up in San Francisco for a while. And so he began working matches out there to earn money as well. One of the guys he works with originally, Clarence Whistler, obviously, was his big career rival, but there were many others he was working with. One of them he sets up with for a little while is Donald Denny, who we've talked about Donald Denny in the past, a very famous strongman. Donald Denny worked with a guy named D.A. McMillan, and they hippodromed all over the place as well. And so now we get Muldoon and Denny. Of course, Denny is Scottish, and he's very famous, does a lot of those Scottish games. He's kind of a ethnic star. And so let's pick up here at the October 10th, 1883. We're going to start out in Rochester, New York. We're going to go coast to coast on this one. Rochester, New York, at the Academy of Music. The attendance, quote, not very large. The international tournament for the National Police Gazette Mixed Styles Championship and Trophy. And this will become a pretty important championship. And mixed styles would become really common going forth for a while. We had, as I've explained, collar and elbow. And your top collar and elbow guys were originally Colonel James H. McLaughlin, John McMahon, in this era, H.M. Duffer, G.W. Flagg. They're your collar and elbow guys. You had Greco-Roman. And originally, the French that introduced Greco-Roman in the United States were Professor Theobald Bauer and Professor William Miller, but it had really transitioned. That torch had been passed to William Muldoon. And again, like I said, William Muldoon was working matches, but he was for real. So it gave more of a air of legitimacy to it with Muldoon there. And Muldoon, I imagine, in his presentation presented it different probably than Bauer and Miller as well, because it seemed to have a lot more respect when Muldoon was doing it. So that's Greco-Roman. And then you had other styles mixed in there. So, catch as catch can, obviously. And then there was Cumberland, and there was side hold and Cornish style and all these different intricacies. Again, think of this like the differences between lucha libre and hardcore and WWE style and, Memphis style. There's just more nuances and slight rules differences than it is saying, oh, these guys were having, NCAA collegiate wrestling. That was not what they were doing. All right, so mixed styles meant the vast majority of matches back then were 2 out of 3 falls. You would have, 2 out of 3 falls or 3 out of 5 falls. So what they started doing was, since these wrestlers were kind of cross-pollinating, McLaughlin would swap over from collar and elbow to wrestle a Greco-Roman guy or something. They'd have these to make this more fair for each person who, it would have one fall would be, catch as catch can, one fall would be Greco-Roman, one fall would be collar and elbow. So it was mix of style. So everybody had, could excel at their own style and then compete with the others as well. So the National Police Gazette and Richard K. Fox come up with this mixed styles championship, and it would be a pretty important belt. Trophy, actually, I think is what they had here. Duncan C. Ross would win. He's going to win this tournament. Eventually, he's going to lose this to, of all people, Colonel James H. McLaughlin is going to come back out of hiatus, out of retirement for a little bit. And so this belt's going to, while it didn't start off very strongly with this tournament and the low attendance, it did become a pretty widely recognized championship. So here in the Mixed Styles Championship for the trophy, participating in this tournament was Duncan C. Ross. Now, he was already recognized as the Mixed Styles Champion, but this really put the polish on it. Also was H.M. Doofer. Again, he was a collar and elbow guy. Merwin Thompson, I think he was a collar and elbow guy too. G.W. Flagg, who was as well. Some guy named Kearns, who I don't know his first name. And a guy named Dennis Gallagher. And Dennis Gallagher, never previously heard about Dennis Gallagher prior to my research on this book. He's not a big name of the pioneer era. But they were surely pushing him as such back here. He was kind of like, remember all these great, whatever era of wrestling you watch, there's always these young guys who look like they're going to be big stars. Most of them never make it. You know, you got your, like from my time period, your Brad Armstrongs, your Tommy Riches, and people like that who are just like, yeah, you know, one day when this guy's so good early on, he's going to be, you know, big time superstar. Well, Dennis Gallagher was that back then. They really, really were. He was out of Buffalo, New York, and they really were giving him a lot of good press. Each person got 1 point for every fall they gained. And at the end of the night, night one rather, the standings were Duncan C. Ross, 5 points, H.M. Doofer, 3 points, Merwin Thompson, 3, Dennis Gallagher, 3, and G.W. Flagg, 2, and, sorry, it was Peter Kearns, I did get a name on him, 0. Now, of interest, especially what we've been talking about, Portland, Oregon, on the same day, October the 10th, 1883, Portland, Oregon, at the New Market Theater. Attendance is only 500, so they're not exactly doing gangbusters out there either. William Muldoon defeated Donald Denny in one fall of a Greco-Roman match. So you can see there's some problems here. So my Dragon King Karl note is this. This show was a complete disaster. Muldoon accused Denny of falsely advertising him in Portland while he was in San Francisco waiting for Clarence Whistler to heal up from a groin injury. Muldoon said publicly in the newspapers that he did not like Denny and wanted to break his neck, but would only come to Portland if the pay and terms were to his agreement. Denny and his moneybacker agreed, and Muldoon took a steamboat to Portland. The night of the show, a big dispute broke out between Denny and the theater manager, F.W. Stecken, and resulted in Denny refusing to wrestle. Eventually, William Muldoon came out and addressed the audience and convinced Denny to come out and wrestle. Muldoon quickly beat him in one fall. Then Denny refused to wrestle again. Muldoon went on a tirade to the audience about Denny being a hippodromer, fake wrestler, and Denny and D.A. McMillan had been putting on fake matches. Muldoon himself came to Portland expecting a real match and got none. Denny was arrested after the show for fraud and collecting money under false pretenses and defaulting on his bonds. So this didn't go the way he thought it was going to go. An early Strangler Lewis appearance takes place here on October the 10th, 1883 in Darlington, Wisconsin. Jack Carkeek beats Evan, the original Strangler Lewis, twice for a purse of $250. Strangler Lewis is getting his start. Evan Strangler Lewis getting his start in this time period, but he's kind of in and out. Like the papers don't talk a lot about him for a while. I don't know if he doesn't wrestle for a long period of time and then makes his big comeback and gets very nationally popular. But he seems to do a lot of wrestling early on in Wisconsin. Then you don't hear about him for several months, maybe even upwards to a year. So I'm interested in finding out what that's all about. On October the 11th, 1883, that Rochester tournament winds up. Duncan C. Ross wins the National Police Gazette World Mixed Styles title. It is interesting that H.M. Doofer and G.W. Flagg withdrew from the tournament because they said the referee was being unfair to them. All right. This story has kind of sad repercussions because I just actually got this yesterday when I was doing research into my book. And here, I forgot to put this in here. October 19th, 1883, Duncan C. Ross announces he is opening a wrestling school and boxing school in Rochester, New York. There will also be a saloon attached, and Dennis Gallagher will be the bartender. Now, here's my Dragon King Karl note on that, and then I'll tell you what I found out just yesterday. How times change. Duncan C. Ross's bartender, Dennis Gallagher, who was the sensation of the Buffalo Wrestling Tournament, is only 18 years old. He couldn't even be in a bar these days. But in a couple of years, well, not even a couple of years, a little over probably a year and a half or so, Duncan C. Ross goes out to San Francisco to wrestle and ends up having to turn around and come right back because his wife died unexpectedly. And this undoubtedly affected Duncan C. Ross very profoundly, as one could imagine, because he then swore off wrestling, sold his saloon, and become a minister. Now, I'm already seeing some signs as I move forward that he gets back into wrestling, and I'm pretty sure he does. But it's kind of sad to see to know that here he is. Look at these notes, and go, "Yeah, here's Duncan C. Ross opening his saloon," which I just yesterday read an article in the newspaper where he closed it down because he had found religion after the death of his wife. I want to really focus on this next note, and this is kind of where we'll spend the rest of today's show on this, because this is a turning point, I think, in wrestling, nationally speaking. This is where wrestling had been very, very popular. In fact, this show I'm about to talk about drew between 4,000 and 4,500 in San Francisco. But after this, for a while, wrestling really starts a downturn. To the point the newspapers are even writing articles about what in the world's happened to wrestling. Why does nobody go to wrestling anymore? They seem to blame it on the rise in popularity of boxing, pugilism. And I think that probably has some truth to it, but I also think that your biggest stars had broken the public's trust. The first big star, Colonel James H. McLaughlin, he's hardly ever even around. John McMahon is pushing 40 years old, and he's battling injuries constantly. Muldoon can't seem to catch a break with, accusations of hippodromes and everything else. And it's Bauer, Professor Theobald Bauer's basically dropped out of sight. I mean, he's still around. His name pops up sometime, but he has been so inundated with being a fake wrestler that he's just not doing big business anywhere. Plus, his running mate, his cohort, Professor William Miller, he's returned to Australia and now lives down there, and is not back in the U.S. And in fact, William Miller wrestles Donald Denny down in Australia and gets his leg broken, and essentially that ends his career. And those were your big playmakers here in the United States. So we're going to talk about November 1st, 1883. We're going to San Francisco, California, and the place is the Mechanics Pavilion. Attendance, as I said, 4,000 to 4,500. World Greco-Roman champion William Muldoon wrestled Clarence Whistler to a draw when the match was stopped due to injury. According to the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper, Muldoon came into the match about 205 pounds to Whistler's 185. During the first fall, the struggle was so intense that Muldoon rolled off the stage, still intertwined with Whistler, and after hitting the floor, continued to wrestle and had to be pulled apart. Muldoon was visibly angry, while Whistler was, quote, the newspaper said, in good humor. Muldoon won the first fall in 38 minutes. After the break, it was clear why Muldoon was angry, as he had a visible contusion around his eye and accused Whistler of punching him while they were on the floor. An hour then expired without a fall, and another rest period was taken. The second fall came rather quickly, with Whistler throwing Muldoon in 1 minute and 42 seconds. Intense drama surrounded the third fall. Muldoon slammed Whistler hard but could not secure a pin, and Whistler rushed Muldoon but then repeated and told the referee he needed a moment to rest and thought he might be injured, this being Whistler. A doctor examined Whistler and determined that he had broken his collarbone and injured his shoulder. And of course, Whistler had either this chronic shoulder injury where he kept getting dislocated, or a kayfabe injury, and I've never been really clear which. Muldoon addressed the crowd and said he did not want to wrestle a crippled man, but he wanted the victory, and he wanted the victory to be awarded to him. and he offered Whistler $1,000 to call the match for him. Now remember, they're tied at this point, one fall apiece. Whistler refused and said he'd rather die than quit. Muldoon said that because he was the world champion, he would not agree to a draw, and Whistler could either take the $1,000 or he would wrestle him, broken collarbone and all. Al Heyman, the backer for Whistler, addressed the crowd and said that under no circumstances would Whistler concede the match. The referee then addressed the crowd and said he was left with no choice. The doctors would not allow Whistler to continue, and since each man had won a fall, then he had to declare the match a draw. Muldoon was incensed about the decision and made it clear to everyone there. The San Francisco Chronicle newspaper stated that the crowd seemed to favor Muldoon's stance and consider him the winner. Yet the Sacramento Bee stated that the crowd felt that Muldoon had lost by at least 3 falls. Muldoon said he had been mistreated by Whistler throughout the match. Now, my Dragon King Karl note for this entry in the book. So what's the story with Clarence Whistler and William Muldoon? Did they really hate each other? Was this a business partnership gone bad? Work or a shoot? With the events being over 140 years ago, it's impossible to say with certainty. There was no Dave Meltzer reporting the inside happenings of pro wrestling in 1883. The best we can do is try to determine the events based on what was said at the time and apply what we know. Decades, even a century after this match, many have tried to piece together the complicated relationship between William Muldoon and Clarence Whistler. Initially, they were clearly friendly enough to work together in combination and extensively tour the country, putting on exhibitions and trading wins and losses in Greco-Roman and catch-as-catch-can matches. Along the way, the partnership dissolved. Some have speculated that a woman became between the two. Muldoon famously claimed to be a lifelong bachelor, though this is not true. He was married twice. Whistler was married at this time. In fact, the San Francisco newspaper stated that his wife took a train from Kansas City to San Francisco to nurse her husband following his injury in the match. Further complicating the matter is that William Muldoon was so infuriated by his treatment in this match that he offered to wrestle any comers for $100 in order to give the money raised to Whistler. He did this publicly in the newspapers. We've talked about this previously on the show. There's enough anecdotal evidence to suggest that both William Muldoon and Clarence Whistler were very real and very skilled wrestlers. They were also both carnies who did a lot of hippodromes. They also seemed to both dislike, yet mutually admire each other as well. Finally, they split the gate receipts for this show. And you had to go to the Eureka, Nevada newspaper of all places to find out this information. But each man took $1,895 from this match after expenses. So, who's to say? So they have a benefit show for Clarence Whistler on November the 4th, 1883 at Recreation Park. It draws 1,200 people. And who of all people, who all is William Muldoon mad at in the world right now? He's mad at Clarence Whistler for not, admitting defeat in the match. He's mad at Donald Denny for calling him up to Portland on a sham deal. But yet they all work together here. Donald Denny beat D.A. McMillan in Greco-Roman. Crowd was dissatisfied with the shortness of the match and jeered it, calling for a collar and elbow fall. After some stalling, D.A. McMillan defeated Donald Denny in collar and elbow. Now here's an interesting name that I know absolutely nothing about, haven't come across it since. Hughes the French Giant defeated Edward Doutard in 2 straight falls of Greco-Roman. Then William Muldoon offered $100 to anybody in the crowd who could beat him, and no one accepted. Then Clarence Whistler, with arm in a sling, addressed the crowd. Now, I have my Dragon King Karl note for this was, for all the vitriol in the newspapers and the arenas between William Muldoon, Donald Denny, and Clarence Whistler, they all had no problem working together here in San Francisco to raise money for Clarence Whistler. Now, there would be more. Donald Denny would set up now in San Francisco for a while after essentially being run out of Portland on a rail. He arrested for defrauding people and everything else. So he's He's not sitting up there in the Pacific Northwest anymore. He moves on. He sits up for a while in San Francisco. Now, let's go back across the country and find out let's get out of this Muldoon mess for a minute and find out what's happening over there with other folks. December the 13th, 1883, Boston, Massachusetts, at the Howard Athenaeum, H.M. Duffer defeated John McMahon for the, quote, the championship of the world. Both H.M. Duffer and John McMahon had been claiming the American Collar and Elbow Championship for some years. Duffer had a far more legitimate claim than McMahon, even though Duffer had lost numerous collar and elbow matches over the last few years. John McMahon had been largely retired, and any matches he had had over the last couple of years were decried as shams. This match was no different. The headline of the Boston Globe read, quote, "Won without a fall. Duffer and McMahon kill time for 2 hours. McMahon then gives up and forfeits the stakes and the gate money. Outside bets declared off. A much disgusted audience." That's literally the headline they had for this match in the Boston paper. New York Times simply called it a fiasco. John McMahon quit the match during a rest period at 2 hours. His backers said that McMahon's mother had recently died and he could not continue. The referee was then left with what decision to make, as neither man had secured a fall. The audience essentially roared that Duffer should get the win and the money, and the referee agreed and awarded it to Duffer despite no fall being had. The Glens Falls New York newspaper reported that one member of the audience, J.W. Sachs, fell dead of a heart attack. I have a Dragon King Carl note for this, and this is, I think, very important, and we'll kind of wrap up here. Most major title history books, lists, and websites have this as a change of the American Collar and Elbow title. If there's one thing I've learned about the Pioneer era, is that title lineages are essentially worthless in this era. Almost every major wrestler was billing themselves as a champion of something, usually champion of America. Virtually every major match was for a championship of sorts. H.M. Duffer is viewed by many title historians as the champion here, yet Duffer has lost many times over. He's probably lost a GW flag 10 times over in collar and elbow wrestling. John McMahon basically just decided he never lost the American Championship in the first place and continued to bill himself as champion. I want to include in my book the most detailed title history I could, but after much consideration, I could not in all honesty do so. I applaud anyone who wishes to attempt to put one together. I find them very interesting, but to do so, I fear, is an exercise in futility. Now, Muldoon doesn't exactly abandon San Francisco at this point. In fact, at the end of 1883, December the 29th, 1883, at the Mechanics Pavilion, 2,500 people come to see him beat the old school master of Greco-Roman, Professor Theobald Bauer, in Greco-Roman wrestling, and beat him in 2 straight falls in 3 hours' time. And Muldoon's going to stay around there for a while, but things go downhill. And in 1884, wrestling attendance starts to become more and more sparse. Now, there is a point in time where Whistler recovers and has another match in San Francisco with Muldoon. But this was essentially the end of it. That was March 24th, 1884. And it again is at the Mechanics Pavilion. This time, the papers, look, the estimates are very wildly for this match. I've seen them 4,000. I've seen them all the way up to 8,000. But William Muldoon wrestled Clarence Whistler to a 3-hour and 10-minute draw for the World Greco-Roman Championship. And this here, March 24th, 1884, this is essentially the downturn of professional wrestling in America for a while. This is that cyclical thing. This is the, hey, nobody's wearing the William Muldoon t-shirt no more. You're not seeing Clarence Whistler dolls in the toy aisle. It's this era's version of that. The match was said to have been mostly stalling. Most papers report that Muldoon simply quit the match, saying he was too tired to continue, while Whistler demanded the match go on. The crowd booed Muldoon. Some papers went so far as to call Muldoon a hippodromer and Whistler real. The bitterness between Muldoon and Whistler had reached a point that they never worked together again. Clarence Whistler turned to boxing for a while, but was knocked out in an 1885 match in San Francisco and then returned to wrestling. Clarence Whistler came to the newspapers in the following days and gave an interview stating that the match was a hippodrome designed to be a draw. He outed everything. I mean, before Jack Pfeffer, there was Clarence Whistler. Whistler said he was telling the papers because he was cheated out of his share of the gate money. One person tried to obtain a warrant with the San Francisco Police Department for William Muldoon for the charge of obtaining money under false pretenses. The authorities refused to issue the warrant. San Francisco newspapers stated that Muldoon was now going to head back east, and he does. Newspapers nationally gave much heavier coverage to the Duncan C. Ross versus Colonel James H. McLaughlin match than to this one. And so this was very much the jump in the shark moment for Muldoon and Whistler and wrestling in general in the United States for a little while. Now, it doesn't just bottom out and devastated or anything like that, but there is a very notable downturn in things. All right, so we'll break off there, and I would appreciate, anyone who wants to support another episode of this show. You can do so with the front page of whenitwascool.com. We prefer and hope, and I want to encourage new Patreon sponsorship. We need some new Patreons to come in over there and join us in our conversation that we're having over there about this sort of stuff. Plus, you get instant access to our great retro pop culture archive. Go to whenitwascool.com, hit any of those Patreon buttons. I think you'll have a lot of fun. If you want to just sponsor an individual episode, the links to PayPal and Cash App are on the front page as well. Just whatever amount you think is appropriate. Really, $10 is kind of the minimum, but people have been giving as much as $50. And hey, if you're a rich billionaire who runs a social media company and builds exploding cars and sends people to Mars, maybe you want to give a little more. Spread it around to a poor fellow soul. So thank you all very much for listening. Thank you very much for joining me here. I'm Karl Stern, and I'll see you here again soon with another show.